here we are for the Cozy Corner of Cinema, episode number 121. This is being recorded on Monday, July 22nd, 2024 at 5:53 p.m. As I'm recording this, the fan is continually blowing on me. I think this has been the third episode in a row that I've had the fan blow on me. Actually, I believe this might be the fourth in a row, because when I was recording the last Peephole Pictures, the fan was blowing on me, and when I put on my headphones to edit the audio, it was quite noticeable. Although I have not tested out the audio on its own, so hopefully it doesn't come out too bad. Actually, no, that's a lie. I apologize. I actually did test out that audio briefly to make sure the fan did not overpower the dialogue, and it did not. So that was just fantastic. And speaking of which, thank you to everyone who has been taking the time to listen to the Peephole Picture series. I always say I do the Cozy Corner of Cinema, and I do Peephole Pictures solely as an outlet to discuss the certain films and to have a outlet to put these opinions to the forefront. But the fact that especially the Peephole Pictures episodes get a very decent amount of viewings and overall generally fairly positive reaction, and that's really wonderful. So thank you to everybody who's been listening to those, even if adult cinema is not your thing. If you're just taking the time to listen at all, it really means a lot to me. And not just those, the Cozy Corner of Cinema episodes. You know, I really love doing this show. I have a lot of fun doing this, even when there's some weeks when things get a little hectic and scheduling-wise it can be very tricky. It is always rewarding to get these episodes completed, get them up online, and get these recommendations out there. So thank you to everyone who has been choosing to use their time to listen to these, whether it be on YouTube and Spotify. That's really, really cool of you, and I appreciate everyone who gives the shows a chance. It's very cool stuff. So we're wrapping up July here. And actually, we got another episode before the end of July, so, well, we're just about wrapping up July, as is getting into the third act of the summer, which will be August, and that'll be great to get into the fading of summer into fall, getting the beautiful fall weather, that cool, crisp, warm weather with the leaves kind of sparkling throughout with their beautiful colors. It's completely wonderful, man. It's a sight to behold, and it's just perfect, especially if you live in a rural area that has a lot of greeneries and a lot of trees. It's just really, really wonderful to see all of them grow. That's just going to be so fantastic to look at. And thankfully, the heat has not been too abrasive this past week. This past week it has been manageable, and today is only Monday. I say past week as in maybe not exactly a week, but like say from Thursday or so. It's been very manageable and really just kind of lovely to be around. It's not so overwhelming and it's not so overbearing that it becomes uncomfortable, but instead we're able to go to bed and actually feel relaxed on whether on our covers or under the covers, and not worry about sticking to the sheets. You ever have that feeling when you wake up and you just feel yourself sweating underneath the blankets? It's just like you just feel like sticky all over. It's a very, very uncomfortable feeling. So you got to get those covers off of you and just get the hell out of there. Change your clothes if you have to, and make sure you're washing your sheets too. People neglect on that, but make sure you're washing your sheets, man. The amount of skin cells that come off it, and just body odor and everything on your bed sheets. You really want to be on top of that. But most importantly, for these summer days, you really want to stay hydrated, and that's a wonderful thing to be 365 days out of the year. But in the summer especially, when the heat can really become abrasive, and really we can forget to drink as much water as we can. Not to the point where you feel sick, that'd be ridiculous. But more so that, there's nothing wrong with juice or cola or alcohol or anything like that. They're all fine in moderation, but water is where it's at, and water is the key here. I got my water here and my hot coffee here that's still a little too hot to drink, so that'll hopefully cool down before the end of the episode. I got the fan blowing right on it, so that is really wonderful. It's such a joy to be alive this time of the year, to really kind of be put to the ultimate test of, with the nice weather out, people are going to want to bring you to events, to places, and it is of utmost importance to lead your life in the direction that you want to lead. And that means doing what it is you want to do if it is beneficial to you. So this summer has been wonderful for getting the job done, getting life's work accomplished. But life's work is never finished. That's why it's life's work. There will always be watching, there will always be reading, and there will always be writing that must be accomplished. And it's up to you to settle what time you're going to devote to life's work. If you want to go out and socialize and go to a restaurant or go to a pub, then God bless you, man. But I'm all about focusing on the work, man. This is really where it's all about, and summer is the ultimate test of that. The winter mentality is beautiful, and that's my favorite time of the year. Although all times of the year are wonderful in their own right, but summer is when it's like a weekend, man. It's like on the weekend, most of us don't have work on the weekends, so that's where you're ultimately tested of just what are you going to do with your time. Are you going to sit around and drink beer and watch TV all day? And if that's what you want to do, then God bless you. Then you should be doing that if that is what you want to do. But if you're like myself, that's the opportunity to get things done, to not dilly-dally, to not meander and just kind of be a passenger in your own life. You really gotta be focused on the end goal here, and that is whatever it is you need to achieve, just making sure you're on top of that. There's so much that has to get done. There's so much writing, so much reading, so much watching. It's never gonna end. I'm gonna go to my deathbed knowing that I wasn't able to do it all, but I'm gonna live to do as much of it as I possibly can and not let any kind of nonsense get in the way. You look at these great filmmakers, these great writers, these great musicians, and they were all focused, man. They got the job done. They put in the hard work. They put in the hours. And now they get to reap the rewards and the benefits. And people enjoy talking about, making their dreams, talking about their dreams. And they want to talk about the end result, but they're not interested in putting in the work. And the work can be very not so glamorous. But as long as you stay true to yourself and stay true to your mission statement, whatever that might be, then ultimately we can all be in awe of you and live our own lives to the fullest extent. I had recently watched a few documentaries lately, and I'll talk about those. I watched one from 2022 that I got from Kino Lorber. It's Godard Cinema, directed by Cyril Luthi, and it's a marginal documentary. It's a solid, enjoyable documentary if you are unfamiliar with Godard and his work. But I wouldn't expect, if you're looking for something more, I think you may want to look elsewhere. This was a fine-made documentary. I thought it kept a very consistent rhythm. There are a lot of film clips shown. Godard has so many films under his belt that you would need a couple hours to properly devote to them. But as I've said before when talking about his work, it's more so cycles of his work. And for me, where I kind of become a little less interested is the post-weekend films, kind of after the student protests of 1968. And that's not to say that he hasn't made worthwhile films after that. Of course not. I am just not as familiar with his work after that. The work of his I have seen post-weekend. I do find varying degrees of quality, but that's to be expected for somebody who is making so many films, and even films in his prime. I don't love all of them. That would be pretty special if they were all brilliant, but some are brilliant, some are great, and some are not so good, and that's all right. But if you're looking for something a bit more in depth, a bit less surface level, this may not be the documentary for you. This Blu-ray is worth it because you get the documentary, and then you do get his last film, his short 20-minute trailer of the film that will never exist, Phony Wars, which will have to be watched sometime soon. His last feature was The Image Book, which is readily available. And that last era of his filmography is something of collages, of montages. Godard is no stranger to montage, but I'm looking at his recent films. like the Image book. Another one that I have not seen, Goodbye to Language, which I do own, but I have not watched yet because of no particular reason. It'll be watched in due time. But if you have not seen many Godard films, you are not very familiar, I would say this is a worthwhile documentary. If you are a fan like myself, I would recommend this solely for if you're interested in just hearing some interviews with some people who had worked with him, seeing some film clips, but ultimately I think if you have a general kind of surface knowledge of Godard and the different eras of his life and how that affected his filmmaking, I don't think there's really much to kind of get out of this. But a worthwhile documentary nonetheless, should you be given context. And also brings to mind films that you can write down. You can go, oh, I haven't seen this film, and I haven't seen this film, and oh, I remember liking that film, and oh, you know what, I wanted to rewatch that film. And that's what it is about. There are also some great clips of Godard himself, but the film never gets into any kind of complexities of him as a person, because that Godard book that I read, which is just called Godard, which can be kind of tricky to recommend, and every time I try to look up the book itself, I can't find it. And the book is in the other room, and I could go pause it, but I don't want to break up the flow of dialogue. So, for the sake of right now, it's not coming up. But that was a really wonderful book that I talked about a little while ago that went into his life when he passed away a couple years ago. So this was... I don't remember when the book came out, but I think it was maybe the 2010s. I could be wrong about that. But either way, it was a very fascinating look into a very troubled and difficult filmmaker, somebody who has made a lot of, has cemented himself into the history of film, specifically into French cinema, being one of the titans of French cinema, along the lines of filmmakers like Jean Renoir and Alain Resnais, Claude Chabrol, of course the big ones, Francois Truffaut, Eric Rohmer. But his complicated relationship with the people around him, and oftentimes there's a lot of complexities to him as a person, somebody who would very quick to push people away, who could be very controlling and demanding, but he could be very loving and be very heartfelt. His films, early films, have a lot of humor in them. I'm looking at some of his films like A Woman is a Woman, for example, or even something more like Pierre Le Fou, which has humor, but it's not overtly humorous, but still has that lightheartedness that with a sting of maybe some darkness underneath. But that's why I always kind of felt... I'm always a little weary about certain evaluations of Godard. I think there's a lot there as a person. I mean, if you're summing up 90 years of somebody's life into an essay or into a piece, then there's a lot of context that is going to be missing. And it always rubbed me the wrong way to the scene in Faces Places by Agnes Varda, when she goes to visit him and he leaves a rude note and tells her to go away. Basically, it feels like context is missing there. And I'm not the biggest fan of that film in general, and that scene in particular. Perhaps it was maybe an admitted bias of already not being a fan of the film, and that's a documentary, by the way, I should say. And when that scene happened, it left a bad taste in my mouth. Not with Godard, and even not really with Varda, but the feeling that there's something that I'm not being told in this situation. But with that said, an interesting man in his own right. There are still plenty of his films that will be seen, and he can be revisited when more of his films have been seen. Because I haven't watched any of his films lately. I am still... that Alphaville 4K is coming out next month. That'll be picked up for sure. It was just this documentary that had brought that to mind. More so than any particular film. But now, let's talk about a really great filmmaker. We're going to talk about Kim Ki Duk, or is it Duck? D-U-K. I should have looked up an interview beforehand. You know, I should really make notes of when it comes to pronouncing these people's names, but Kim Ki Duk, controversial filmmaker for his personal life, and even for some of his films, so to speak. I'm in the process of going through his filmography right now. I have seen about 10 of his films so far, and watching them chronologically, it is fascinating to see the journey of a filmmaker he was coming into, because his early work I find very hit or miss, and none that are outright terrible, but for the most part I've been fairly lukewarm on some titles like Birdcage Inn and Address Unknown. But then what really kind of instigated or kicked off this whole walkthrough of his filmography was when I had seen his most well-known film, Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring. I saw that film a couple years ago, and I watch a minimum of about 1,000 films a year, give or take short films as well. So maybe without short film, yeah, I mean, honestly, even without short films, probably about 1,000 or so. But anyways, so you watch a lot of his films. So I'm watch a lot of films, and there's a lot of films that ultimately kind of just stick with you for any myriad of reason. And Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring is one that stuck with me, as well as another film that I will speak of in a moment. But it's one that, upon rewatching, it has not lost any of its grace and any of its beauty. It's a wonderful story that takes place over a period of this young boy growing up, who doesn't have a name. He's just the monk. We have a couple different versions of this character, from when he's a young child to when he is getting a little bit older, and then he's getting older than that. And he lives in this isolated kind of, I don't even know what to call it really. It's like this house that's on the water. It's like this little shack that's on the water, like a prayer kind of place that people can come to. You have to go in there by boat because it's all offshore. But he lives there with another monk, presumably his father, played by Ong Yi-soo, I should say. And actually, Kim Ki Duk acts in the film as well. But it goes through, as the title says, different seasons in the life of this young monk who has a tumultuous life. At the beginning of the film, in the first segment of Spring, it is almost as if he has been cursed upon for some actions that he does. Very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very cruel actions that ultimately may or may not seal his fate going forward. And truthfully, I'm sure there are deeper layers to this film than somebody like me can appreciate on a surface level. I truthfully am not very familiar with perhaps a lot of the sequences in this film that may feel not necessarily out of place, but feel as though there's something might be more going on. Now, there are some moments that even someone like me could get a feeling of, get an understanding of, without having to do any further research. There's a action that's repeated a couple times of characters who write on these pieces of paper and cover up their eyes, their ears, their nose, and their mouth to kind of rid of all the senses. And in the context of the film, I was able to get from that. But the film itself, I think, has such an easy tone to it, but it's dealing with these heavier themes of this character, and who even, goes on to do something in his life that he's not even fully able to comprehend what he's done. And anyway, I want to jump into another film as well, because I don't want to talk about too much of this film, because this film I think is probably far more well known. I think if one should be interested, this would be a good one to watch. But the one that I think on a second viewing I may have gotten a bit more out of than the first viewing is not his follow-up film, but his follow-up to that, which was 3 Iron from 2004. It's a very interesting concept of a film. This also has this kind of relaxed sort of mood and tone to it, like Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, Spring, where there's not a lot of score in the film. There's not a lot of big camera movements. Characters really are kind of all on the same wavelength. But what this film does, as compared to spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, is that, for one, I think it's a far more romantic film, and becomes a troubling romance, because in this film we have this character, Tae-suk, played by Jae, who is somebody who is, he breaks into, or not even breaks, I guess breaks, yeah, but he is able to pick the lock and sleep in people's houses when they're not home. So there'll be a little flyer on the door that'll be for some advertisement, and if somebody was home, they would have grabbed it. So he is able to go into these places, some extravagant, some not so extravagant, and he likes to sleep there. He'll take pictures of himself there, and every now and then he'll kind of play a little trick. So, for example, he will, he'll mess with the scale in one of these houses, so he'll actually make it so there is less weight on it when you stand on it, or he will mess with a stereo, or just little games like this. Ultimately harmless, but tricks nonetheless. But anyways, he gets into and I don't want to give the whole film away, so I'm not going to give away basically the second half of this film, but he basically ends up in a situation where he gets himself in between this relationship with these two people and the trouble that comes with it. It's a bit of a twisted romance in the way of almost its conclusion, but I think ultimately that it works. It's a woman who is very lonely in her life, is in a very troubled relationship, and is able to, for better or for worse, stick with him. She is able to see in this character, ultimately he is a harmless character. There's a lot we don't know about him. We can tell he's been on his own for a while, the way he has almost perfected sneaking around, and that becomes a major plot point in the third act of the film. He's able to really effortlessly get around places. I mean, so much so he can be right behind somebody and they never will even know that he's right behind them. He's really as silent as the wind. And the relationship from that. There's a great middle section of the film which ultimately kicks off the third act, where they find themselves in a situation and they don't really know what to do, because it's a tricky situation without giving too much away. There is a you would say an obvious thing to do, but obvious isn't so obvious, because if you do that, then that opens up a can of worms. But it's a very it's a long sequence without dialogue, and it's a very loving sequence that in another film could come off as morbid, but it doesn't play off that way as well. Get a sip of this coffee here. As well, talking about this character being harmless, that doesn't mean he is free from harm in this film. He is able to intentionally inflict violence on others in an interesting way, involving a 3-iron golf club that it may not be the way you think of, but in the context of the film, it actually works fairly well. And for somebody who is able to perfect something that they're doing, that there is more that going on with that character in his background. There's a lot of information that we don't know about him, but even just these little moments of him even being able to perfect this violence with this 3-iron, it says a lot more than I will get into. But even there's a point where a character gets seriously harmed, and that starts to kind of raise our morals for this character, because although they are not intentionally inflicting violence on most others and do want to do the best in the situation, ultimately that is the one point where we get a sort of ambivalence to this character of someone kind of just drifting through life, even when they're in a situation that is going to probably go bad for them. They're ultimately ambivalent about it, and they are not as interested in something that they could probably get themselves out of. It's interesting watching the evolution of Kim Ki Duk as a filmmaker, because his early work I find much more abrasive, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but his earlier films so far I found to be much more violent, much more, the characters in his earlier films much less sympathetic, and that's okay. Characters don't need to be sympathetic to be interesting characters, so that's not a detriment. But it's very fascinating around the time of maybe the Coast Guard, which was his previous film before Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring, where I think that's where his characters started to get a bit more interesting, because the only one of his films before the Coast Guard that I thought actually really stood out in terms of really strong character writing was The Isle. And maybe I've talked about that before, I don't remember, but that is a very fascinating look at these this fishing place, kind of like in Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, Spring, these like little, a much smaller kind of shack that's on these waters, and the character, this main character and a woman that are out there, and it feels at times with some of his earlier work that there is something of a mean streak running through them. I think it was Address Unknown. I'm getting the films mixed up. I don't remember if it's Address Unknown or Bad Guy, but remember one of them had a pretty consistent mean streak running through it that wasn't off-putting, but it definitely kind of felt more in line with his previous work. Whereas when we get into these films, and 3 Iron is the last one that I've watched, so I still have quite a bit more to go through, but the evolution of him, not just the way he is directing these characters, but sort of the feelings of these films. Spring, Summer, Samaritan Girl, and 3 Iron have the very mellow kind of feeling to them. They all are not really concerned with rushing to the next sequence. They all really take their time, but not in a way where they're slow paced and they are dull or anything like that. All three of them, I think, are incredibly interesting films, which is a very shallow and surface level thing to say, but because I'm now watching the works of him and seeing how some of his films have been working more than others and vice versa, the fact that these have been all three on a pretty steady stream kind of shows, I would say, actually, I'm not even kind of, it really does show kind of the strong evolution of him as a filmmaker, and it'll be interesting to see what happens from here on out, because the only film I think I generally hear in context, in general kind of social conversation, is Pieta from 2012. The rest of his films I'm not familiar with. Not that it matters, because after going through the works of filmmakers like John Sayles and Vittorio De Sica, it's clear that some of a director's best work can be some of their most underrated work. I think of films like City of Hope by John Sayles and The Children Are Watching Us by Vittorio De Sica, two of my very favorite films by those filmmakers that are fairly underseen, in my opinion, or at least not brought up in the general kind of conversation. So it doesn't really matter about the social kind of pretext to whether or not these films are discussed or not, but it is interesting that, at least in terms of his filmography, it went from Spring, Summer, 3 Iron, and then Pieta, almost a decade later. So, but it's very interesting to go through his work. I will report back when they are complete. His last film was released, I think, posthumously. Yes, he died in 2020, and his last film was posthumously released in 2022, I believe, Call of God. But his last actual film that he was alive for was Dissolve in 2019. So, interesting filmmaker. We will report back on and follow up wherever these films may go. But that will be it for this episode. It is already getting a bit cloudy out there, and the coffee is still actually kind of warm. But it's getting there. Actually, it's fairly warm, I would say. Okay, thank you so much for listening. It's a beautiful life to live. Let's make the most of it. Now is the time for us to live our dreams, to follow through on the things we said we were going to do, to not dilly-dally, to not sit around and talk about what we're going to do, but instead do the things we're going to do. Everybody take care. God bless.